Welcome to our series on the Westminster Confession of Faith. We are glad that you are here. Today we come to section 4 of chapter 5, which is perhaps the most difficult and pastorally sensitive section in the entire chapter on providence. The question before us is this: how does God's providence relate to sin? If God governs all things, does his governance extend even to the sinful actions of his creatures? And if so, how can he remain holy? This is a longer section because the topic demands careful, nuanced treatment. The confession will teach us that God's providence does indeed extend to sin, but in a way that preserves his perfect holiness and places all moral responsibility squarely on the creature. In the first 3 sections of this chapter, we learned that God's providence is comprehensive. He upholds, directs, disposes, and governs all creatures, actions, and things. He works through second causes. He ordinarily uses means, but is free to work without them. But this comprehensive scope immediately raises the most difficult question of all. What about sin? If God governs everything, does his governance extend to evil? When Adam fell, when Satan rebelled, when Judas betrayed Jesus, when every act of wickedness throughout history has taken place, was God governing those events? And if he was, how can he be holy? This is the hardest question about the doctrine of providence. Many Christians are uncomfortable even raising it. But the Westminster divines believed the Bible gives us a clear and careful answer. Section 4 provides that answer, and it does so with remarkable precision and pastoral care. It will affirm God's sovereignty over sin while absolutely protecting his holiness. Let us now read the text of Westminster Confession, chapter 5, section 4. Because this section is lengthy, we will read it across 2 slides. The almighty power, unsearchable wisdom, and infinite goodness of God so far manifest themselves in his providence, that it extendeth itself even to the first fall, and all other sins of angels and men, and that not by a bare permission, but such as hath joined with it a most wise and powerful bounding, and otherwise ordering and governing of them, in a manifold dispensation to his own holy ends. Notice the careful language. God's providence extends even to sin, but it does so not by bare permission, not by a passive allowance, but through active bounding, ordering, and governing, all directed toward God's own holy purposes. The confession continues, "Yet so, as the sinfulness thereof proceedeth only from the creature, and not from God, who, being most holy and righteous, neither is nor can be the author or approver of sin." This is the vital safeguard. While God governs sin, the sinfulness, the moral guilt, the corruption, the evil intent, comes entirely from the creature. God is not tainted by sin. He does not cause it in any morally blameworthy sense. He neither authors it nor approves of it. The confession holds 2 truths in perfect tension: God's complete sovereignty over sin and his complete holiness despite that sovereignty. The confession says God's providence extends even to the first fall. This is the fall of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, the event that introduced sin and death into the entire human race. The Westminster divines want us to understand that even this catastrophic event was not outside God's sovereign governance. The fall was not an accident. It was not a surprise to God. It was not a failure in his plan. From all eternity, God's decree encompassed the fall. He permitted it, not by bare permission, as we will see, but in a way that was wise, purposeful, and directed toward his own holy ends. But this does not make God responsible for the sin. Adam and Eve freely chose to disobey God. They were not coerced or manipulated. They acted from their own desires, and they bore full responsibility for their choice. Berkhoff explains that the Reformed view has always held that the fall was included in God's decree, but that God decreed to permit it rather than to effect it directly. The cause of sin lies in the creature's will, not in God's. The confession goes further. God's providence extends not only to the first fall, but to all other sins of angels and men. Every sinful act in history, from the rebellion of Satan and the fallen angels to every human sin that has ever been committed, falls under God's sovereign governance. Nothing escapes his control. This is a staggering claim, and the confession makes it deliberately. The Westminster divines wanted to close every loophole. There is no category of evil that lies outside God's providence. The sins of individuals, the wickedness of nations, the corruption of entire civilizations, all are comprehended within God's governance. Charles Hodge emphasizes that this does not mean God approves of these sins, or that he is the efficient cause of them. It means that in his inscrutable wisdom, he has determined to permit them and to govern them in a way that serves his purposes. Isaiah chapter 10 provides a striking example. God calls Assyria the rod of my anger. He is using Assyria as an instrument of judgment against Israel. But the text immediately adds, "But he does not so intend, and his heart does not so think." Assyria acts from its own wicked motives. God's purpose and Assyria's purpose are different, even though God uses Assyria's sin to accomplish his own holy end. One of the most important phrases in this section is, "not by a bare permission." The confession explicitly rejects the idea that God merely allows sin to happen, as though he stands by passively while creatures act on their own. This would be a weak, passive view of God's sovereignty, and the Bible does not support it. Instead, the confession teaches that God's governance of sin is active. He does not merely permit sin, he bounds it, orders it, and governs it. He sets the limits beyond which it cannot go. He directs its course so that it accomplishes his purposes, and he governs its outcomes so that they serve his holy ends. Robert Shaw explains that the phrase, "not by a bare permission," is aimed at those who would weaken God's sovereignty by suggesting that sin lies outside his control. A bare permission would mean God merely watches while things happen. But the God of the Bible is never a spectator. He is always the sovereign Lord, even over evil. At the same time, this active governance must be carefully distinguished from causation. God does not cause creatures to sin. He does not inject evil desires into their hearts. He does not coerce their wills. His governance of sin is real, but morally blameless. This is a mystery that the confession does not attempt to fully resolve, but it marks out the boundaries of what Scripture teaches. The confession describes God's governance of sin as a most wise and powerful bounding. This means God sets limits on sin. Evil can go this far and no further. The book of Job provides the clearest illustration of this truth. When Satan wanted to afflict Job, he could not act independently. He had to appear before God and receive permission. And God set explicit boundaries. "Behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand." Later, God expanded the boundary. "Behold, he is in your hand. Only spare his life." In both cases, Satan was powerful, but he was bounded. He could not exceed the limits God had set. This bounding of sin is not limited to the story of Job. Throughout history, God restrains evil. He prevents wicked men from carrying out the full extent of their intentions. He holds back catastrophes that would otherwise be even worse than they are. Calvin calls this the bridle of providence. God puts a bridle on the wicked, directing their actions within bounds they cannot exceed. The psalmist captures this beautifully. "Surely the wrath of man shall praise you, the remnant of wrath you will put on like a belt." Even human wrath is made to serve God's purposes, and whatever remains is restrained. The confession says God not only bounds sin, but also orders and governs it in a manifold dispensation to his own holy ends. This means God actively directs sinful events toward his purposes. He does not merely put a fence around evil. He takes evil and works it into the fabric of his plan. The story of Joseph is one of the clearest examples in all of Scripture. Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery out of jealousy and hatred. Their intention was purely malicious, yet God took their sin and directed it toward an extraordinary good. As Joseph himself said to his brothers in Genesis chapter 50, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive, as they are today." Notice the precision of Joseph's words. The same event had two different meanings. The brothers meant evil, God meant good. Both were true simultaneously. God did not cause the brothers to sin, but he governed their sin so that it accomplished his saving purpose. The phrase manifold dispensation means that God's governance of sin takes many different forms. Sometimes he restrains it. Sometimes he redirects it. Sometimes he uses it as a means of judgment or discipline. The ways are various, but the end is always holy. If there is one event in all of history that demonstrates the truth of this section more clearly than any other, it is the cross of Jesus Christ. The crucifixion was the greatest sin ever committed, the murder of the sinless Son of God. And yet it was simultaneously the greatest act of salvation in the history of the world. The early church understood this perfectly. In Acts chapter 4, the apostles pray, "For truly in this city there were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place." Every party involved, Herod, Pilate, the Gentile soldiers, the Jewish leaders, acted freely from their own sinful motives. They were morally responsible for what they did. Peter said as much on the day of Pentecost, "You crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men." Yet at the very same time, they were doing whatever God's hand and plan had predestined to take place. God's sovereignty and human responsibility are both fully present in the same event. The cross is the ultimate proof that God can govern the worst sin imaginable and turn it toward the greatest possible good, the salvation of his people. The confession now states the critical safeguard. The sinfulness thereof proceedeth only from the creature and not from God. While God governs sin, he is not the source of its moral evil. The sinfulness, the corruption, the guilt, the wicked intent comes entirely from within the creature. James makes this point with absolute clarity in his epistle. "Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire." The source of temptation is not God, it is the creature's own sinful desires. God is not the author of those desires. He does not plant evil in the human heart. The creature's sin flows from the creature's own corruption. This is why human beings are fully responsible for their sins. Even though God governs sinful events, the moral guilt rests entirely on the creature who commits the sin. Berkhoff explains that God's decree with respect to sin is a decree to permit, not to effect. The creature sins willingly from its own corrupt nature and therefore bears the full weight of moral responsibility. The confession closes with its strongest declaration. God, being most holy and righteous, neither is nor can be the author or approver of sin. Notice the strength of this language. God does not merely choose not to author sin. He cannot be the author of sin. It is a logical impossibility given his nature. God is essentially holy. Holiness is not merely something God does, it is what God is. Therefore, for God to be the author of sin would be for God to contradict his own nature, which is impossible. God also does not approve of sin. He does not look upon evil with satisfaction or endorsement. He hates sin. His governance of it is not an endorsement of it. Rather, he governs it in order to bring about good from it and to demonstrate his justice in judging it. A. Hodge uses a helpful analogy from the natural world. The sun, by the same rays, melts wax and hardens clay. The same cause produces different effects depending on the nature of the material. Similarly, God's providence, which is good and holy in itself, produces different effects depending on whether it encounters a holy or a sinful creature. The sinfulness comes from the creature, not from God. This is indeed a mystery. We cannot fully explain how God can govern sin without being morally responsible for it. But the confession is not attempting a philosophical resolution. It is marking out the boundaries of biblical teaching. Scripture teaches both truths, and we are called to hold them together. There are two errors that this section is designed to prevent. The first error is making God the author of sin. Some philosophies and even some theological systems have drifted in this direction, suggesting that God is the direct cause of evil, or that sin is somehow necessary for his glory. The confession emphatically rejects this. God is not the author of sin. His holiness is non-negotiable. The second error is removing sin from God's governance. Some well-meaning Christians, in their desire to protect God's holiness, have gone too far in the other direction. They suggest that God merely observes sin, that he has no control over it, that evil runs loose in the world apart from his sovereignty. This view may seem to protect God's character, but it actually undermines the comfort of the gospel. If God does not govern evil, then evil is ultimately beyond his control, and that leaves us without hope. The confession refuses to make either error. It holds both truths in tension. God is fully sovereign over sin, and God is fully holy. Francis Turretin, in his Institutes of Elenctic Theology, explains that God's decree concerning sin is a decree to permit, not a decree to cause. The permission is certain and purposeful, but the moral responsibility lies entirely with the creature. This doctrine is not merely academic, it is profoundly pastoral. If God does not govern evil, then the suffering we experience at the hands of sinful people is random and meaningless. There would be no guarantee that good could ever come from it. But because God does govern sin, because he bounds it, orders it, and directs it toward his holy ends, we can have confidence that no evil we face is beyond his control or outside his purposes. This does not mean that evil is good. The confession is clear that God does not approve of sin, but it does mean that evil is never the last word. God will bring good out of it, in his own time and in his own way. And the ultimate proof of this truth is the cross of Christ. The worst sin in history, the murder of the Son of God, was overruled by God to become the greatest act of salvation the world has ever known. If God can do that with the cross, he can bring good out of anything we face. Thomas Watson, in his Body of Divinity, captures this beautifully. God makes his people's crosses ladders to climb up to heaven by. The evil that others intend for our harm, God governs for our good and for his glory. Here are our discussion questions. We have 4 questions divided across 2 slides. Question 1. How does Genesis 50:20 illustrate the confession's teaching that God governs sin to his own holy ends? The key insight is that the same event had 2 different purposes operating simultaneously. Joseph's brothers intended evil, God intended good. Both intentions were real. God did not cause the brothers' evil intent, but he governed the event so that it served his saving purpose. Question 2. Why does the confession insist that God's governance of sin is not by a bare permission? What would be lost if we said God merely allows sin to happen? If God merely permits sin passively, then evil is ultimately beyond his control. This would undermine the comfort of texts like Romans 8:28, which assures us that God works all things together for good. A bare permission would leave evil uncontrolled and purposeless. Question 3. How does the cross of Christ demonstrate both God's sovereignty over sin and the full moral responsibility of the humans involved? Acts 2:23 and Acts 4:27-28 show that the crucifixion was God's predetermined plan. Yet the humans who carried it out are called lawless men who acted freely. God's sovereignty did not reduce their guilt. Their guilt did not limit God's sovereignty. Both were fully present. Question 4. What comfort does this doctrine offer to someone who is suffering because of the sinful actions of others? It means that their suffering is not random or meaningless. A wise and good God governs even the evil that has been done to them. He will bring good from it in his own time. The cross proves that God can take the worst evil and turn it into the greatest good. This does not trivialize suffering, but it gives hope that evil will not have the last word. Let us review what we have learned in this important section. God's providence extends even to sin, including the first fall of Adam and Eve and all other sins of angels and men. This governance is not a bare permission, but involves active bounding, ordering, and governing of evil events. God directs sinful events toward his own holy ends through what the confession calls a manifold dispensation, meaning he uses many different means and methods to work good from evil. The sinfulness of every evil act proceeds entirely from the creature, not from God. God tempts no one. He plants no evil in the human heart. The moral guilt of sin rests solely on the one who commits it. And God, being most holy and righteous, neither is nor can be the author or approver of sin. His holiness is not merely preserved, it is non-negotiable and absolute. The cross of Christ is the supreme proof of all these truths. The worst sin in history, the murder of the Son of God, was overruled by God to become the greatest act of salvation the world has ever known. Next, in Section 5, we will explore how God's providence applies specifically to believers. We will see that God sometimes allows His own children to experience temptation and the corruption of their own hearts, not to destroy them, but to humble them, to make them more dependent on His grace, and to draw them closer to Himself. Thank you for joining us.